Okay, let's get back to it again. I thought it might be useful here before moving on to slow down and rewind a little bit, and yet again compare the American Revolution and the French Revolution. We did this at the outset of the lecture, and this is more for you than it is for me. It would be useful and helpful for you to compare these two elements in particular when studying. It'll help you to understand both revolutions, their similarities, their differences, and keep it all kind of sort of up in your head. So you might want to compare and contrast the Declaration of Independence on the American side and the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen on the French side, which we're about to get to, and do the same for George Washington, we've already talked about, and Maximilien Robespierre, the most important leader on the French side in the French Revolution. The night of August 4th, 1789. If the history books talk about the night of whatever it is, it must have been important somehow. So this is the National Assembly, that assembly that formed, mainly made up of disgruntled members of the Third Estate who left the Estates General and formed their own body, as we saw in our last lecture segment. They dedicated themselves to not disbanding and going home until they'd written a constitution for France, which they actually did within a couple of years or less than a couple of years, but they did a lot of things in between as well. And on this particular night, things showed signs already of getting a little bit crazy. And this is still at the mild phase of the revolution, where they're pretty much pushing Enlightenment ideas that are sensible and rational, and certainly well within the realm of sanity. But the question of noble privileges, all of those privileges that nobles had by law that nobody else had, for instance, right not to be taxed or exclusive hunting rights, and there were many, many, many more. But noble privilege vanished in one, as it says, astonishing night of legislation. One member after another of this body got up, and most of them were the enlightened nobles that were there, a minority in the room. But most of those who got up to propose, let's do away legally with this noble privilege, most of them were nobles themselves that were doing it. So why were enlightened nobles seemingly in a competition to see who could give away more of their privileges? And a competition that seemed fevered and in some ways desperate and quite emotional at times. So much so that one of the noblemen in attendance who witnessed this, and he was in favor of the revolution, but what he saw before him frightened him, and he actually wrote a note to his friend, a fellow nobleman who was actually holding the gavel that night, kind of keeping order, and he wrote him a kind of a secret little note and had it passed down to him, which said, "Dismiss the meeting. They're all out of their minds." Again, nobles competing with each other to give away their rights and their privileges, which the crazy part is not that they're giving them away. It's that they're so frenzied in doing so, and they seem to be kind of competing with each other to outdo the other. So this already sort of at least slightly irrational, even in the normal phase of the revolution, if you can call it that. And they did do away with all the privileges in one night. On the other side of August 4th, the nobility didn't have any special privileges in law, and they'd had dozens of them just the night before, going back hundreds of years. Next, the same group, the Assembly, while it's working on a constitution, which takes longer, issued this famous document, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, which in many ways could be seen as the death warrant of the old regime, meaning the monarchy of Louis XVI and earlier, Louis XIV, going back also hundreds of years. This is somewhat like the Declaration of Independence and was certainly influenced by it. It was a statement of principles, not so much law, but a statement, kind of a mission statement, if you will. And so was the Declaration of Independence in a way. We already noted that that document, written primarily by Mr. Jefferson, laid out some of the basic principles, the most important moral, constitutional, legal, political principles of the American Revolution. And the French revolutionaries are seeking to do something similar here. Professor Perry, who writes a textbook I sometimes use for Western civilization, said that the document expressed liberal and universal goals of the philosophes, which means Enlightenment thinkers, some of whom we already covered, and the particular interests of the bourgeoisie, which means middle class, in proclaiming the inalienable right to liberty of person, to freedom of religion and thought, and to equal treatment under the law. The Declaration affirmed the dignity of the individual. It asserted that the government belonged not to any ruler, but to the people as a whole, and that its aim was the preservation of the natural rights of the individual. Unquote. Well, so far so good. That all is in keeping with what the Americans were doing on the other side of the Atlantic just a few years before. However, it's a little more complicated than that. I think the Declaration of Rights of Man, in some ways, in some places, contradicts itself. Because within the actual document itself, and I quote from a few sections here, and I'll read them first and unpack them after. One section says, the principle of all sovereignty, which means who has the power, rests essentially in the nation. Nobody and no individual may exercise authority which does not emanate expressly from the nation. Now, nation is a curious word for them to use here. It could be just a matter of semantics translated from French into English, but I don't think so. Given what I know about the rest of the document and the rest of the revolution, keep in mind the colonists in America used the phrase and terminology of consent of the governed. Right? They're saying all power comes from come from consent of the governed. The nation really connotes something more collective. The American Revolutionists, remember, were thinking about individual rights, individual liberty, and consent of the governed meant the consent of all of the many individuals that make up society. So this is much more collective in orientation than the American version of it, which, okay, that is all well and good, but that can pose particular problems for democracy and certainly for liberty. Another section of the document states the law only has the right to prohibit those actions which are injurious to society. No hindrance should be put in the way of anything not prohibited by the law, nor may anyone be forced to do what the law does not require. But again, society, right? Nation in the first section there, first quote, society in the second one. Nothing wrong with, of course, protecting and promoting the interests of the whole society. But when you're talking about things more in the collective sense, in the group sense, as far as the individual sense, you have something quite different, between the two. And finally, it says the law is the expression of the general will. The general will, which is a phrase actually taken from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Enlightenment thinker, who the French revolutionaries loved and were devoted to. So this isn't any big surprise. But the general will was a somewhat amorphous concept, which isn't translatable into the majority. If you read Rousseau, to him the general will meant what the people, the masses of people, would want if they knew what was best for them, but they generally don't. So we have to ask a lawgiver, kind of an expert, a wise person who's going to govern them and tell them what's best for them, acting, of course, in their best interest. But it does have, as Rousseau's work did, especially later in his life, a totalitarian, non-democratic ring to it. So how does all this compare to the Declaration of Independence? Again, I'll leave it to you to do that, but it will be helpful for you to at least delve into that question somewhat. Also, around the same time, in the early months of the revolution, this time going into the next year, but still fairly early, is the civil constitution of the clergy, an extremely controversial oath of loyalty, among other things, required of all clerics, priests, bishops, church officials to the revolutionary government, which basically meant that the revolutionary government, the National Assembly, is telling the public, or the clergy and the public, that the clergy is now going to be loyal to the French government first, and only kind of in a distant second place to the Pope in Rome. And this didn't go over well, first of all, because it bucked centuries of tradition, and about half of the clergy, to show you how controversial it was, refused to take the oath, and they lost their jobs accordingly. So about half of the clergy were so incensed by this, they were willing to lose their jobs to stand up for the principle, to stand up for what they believed was the correct way of, dealing with the Catholic Church, which wasn't this way, according to them. So this also included the civil constitution, the confiscation of enormous amounts of church property by the revolutionary government and state. This was also controversial, but they were pretty smart, because the new government, the king is still around, by the way. At this point, while they're writing the first constitution, the revolutionaries had in mind a constitutional monarchy, which would have shared power with the king. So Louis XVI, though he was kind of quietly frittering away his time in his own palace, trying to mouth some support for what's going on, but secretly plotting against the revolution and trying to figure out a way to put it down, just never, as I said before, finding that he had the advantage and didn't move, or wasn't going to move until he had the advantage. Nonetheless, he's still kind of in the mix, according to these guys. The constitution they're writing is going to still have him sharing power with an elected legislature, so it wouldn't be an absolute monarchy any longer if this goes through, and it did, but it would be a constitutional monarchy where the king is still there and has still some power. The king got in the way of that and kept it from happening by his own ridiculous actions. He tried to escape France secretly to go to Austria or to Allied territory, where he could hopefully, in his mind, try to convince foreign armies to attack France and put him back on the throne. But he got caught by his own people and forced back to Paris. And from that point forward, the monarchy was a done deal. It took them a while, but eventually the French Revolutionary government here voted to disband the monarchy and to abolish the monarchy, try the king for treason, and he was found guilty and eventually guillotined. The guillotine being the execution device of choice in France during the Revolution. The disrespect shown to the church here in the civil constitution of the clergy shows the revolutionary government just getting warmed up. And the government proceeded to try to actually destroy the French Catholic Church, confiscating and damaging, destroying many churches, and just desecrating them all over the place. Eventually tried to establish a civil religion in its place and convert Catholic churches and Christian places of worship into civil religious worship, their own kind of created non-God-oriented religion. And this was a disaster, and it's, again, a sign of, I think, things to come. So in all of these cases, the night of August 4th, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, Civil Constitution of the Clergy, in some ways, these are all in keeping with Enlightenment thought and showing that the revolution wasn't completely out of control yet. Maybe it was still salvageable, but there are hints in all three of these. That's why I focused on these, that something more sinister was sort of about to happen. Not that it was necessarily planned by anybody, but with the advantage of hindsight, I think we can see this. And this polarized France considerably, and would continue to, especially peasants, poor farmers in the countryside, tended to be very loyal to the Catholic Church, and they were appalled by what the new government, was doing here. France, if they didn't have enough on their plate already, again, this is the French Revolutionary Government, the National Assembly, they declared war on Austria, and eventually Prussia declared war back on them, so they're fighting Austria and Prussia at once. Eventually, other countries they're fighting at the same time. Why? Again, don't they have enough issues trying to consolidate and make a revolution successful? It's not sure to be successful anyway. That's a lot to their hands are full domestically. To add a major foreign policy commitment here in a war, it's like just doubling their problems. But why? Why would they do it? One of the political parties, not an organized political party that we have today, but nonetheless a faction known as the Girondins, which for a time were the most radically left-wing faction in the assembly, in the government. They feared being invaded first because Austria, for instance, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, wife of Louis XVI, was the sister of the Habsburg Austrian emperor. So the other countries of Europe weren't wild about the French rising up and overthrowing their king. So there have been some rumblings in Austria, Prussia, and other places about the crowned heads of other countries coming to the rescue of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. So the Girondins thought, they're going to invade us. We might as well invade them before to get a jump on them. They also saw a perceived need to bolster revolutionary zeal. To them, it looked like, and it may have been true, that support for the revolution was flagging to some degree, and so what better way to get everyone on board than to find a foreign enemy and say, hey, they're threatening to attack us, they're threatening our society, our way of life, they're threatening the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, we have to go to war with them. Wars have a tendency, at least for a time, to rally a people behind their governments and sort of bring them together. And this is what the Girondins and at least the majority at the time in the assembly are counting on. They also believe they were duty-bound. This isn't just the Girondins, this is many of the revolutionary groups in the assembly, to spread revolutionary values to other countries, which they eventually do, mainly through the career and conquests of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon referred to himself later on as the revolution on horseback. Like, I'm bringing the revolution to you at the point of guns, yes, but just sit back and let us bomb or bombard your country with artillery fire, and then once your king surrenders, hey, then you can have liberty, equality, fraternity. And one of the early battles in the war against Austria and Prussia, the Battle of Valmy, the French troops did show signs of sort of fighting with a real zeal. The French call élan, meaning that they seem to have been had an extra sort of spirit behind them, an extra energy based on sort of the idea and ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The famous German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe happened to be traveling. He wasn't a soldier, but he happened to be traveling with the Prussian army and was there at Valmy. And he noticed himself, wrote about it after the fact, that the French troops fighting with passionate fervor. Some scholars then see this as the start of modern ideological war and the beginnings of nationalism. People feeling kind of an intense patriotic pride in their country, not just soldiers, but in this case, soldiers especially. And this is also in some ways a prelude to what the revolutionary government called the levée en masse, which was the first episode in all of history, anywhere, of mass conscription. So as this war continued, the French continued to try to rally the public in support of the war, but also instituted a draft to get a gigantic army into the field, which they did. But you see that things are starting to already get more complicated, and that will only continue. Next, the Paris Commune and the Jacobin clubs, which were related to each other. The Paris Commune was the local government of Paris, sort of like the city council of Paris. The Jacobin clubs often featured speakers and discussion groups about revolutionary politics, and all of the city's primary leaders, even some of the more radical leaders in the assembly, would show up and make speeches and talk there. The clubs then helped spread the most radical revolutionary ideas and ideals throughout the city of Paris and beyond. Shrewd radical politicians used such local institutions like the Paris Commune, other things like it in other cities, and the public support they got there to often be able to rival the power of the National Convention or the Assembly. In essence, they created a shadow government. The Assembly went through kind of 3 iterations and changes. And the first Assembly, the one that brought you the Declaration of Rights of Man, wrote into its own rules that it would disband once it got its constitution written, etc. And when they held elections again, they prohibited themselves from running for office to sit in the assembly a second time. So many of those guys then retreated to the Paris Commune, the city local government, and carried on their political machinations from there. And so that's partly also how you can see then that the local Paris government actually rivaled the national government. They're both in the same place, Paris. But this makes things more complicated and starts to cause a great deal of intense competition and eventually kind of fanatical competition. By the summer of 1792, quoting from Ian Davidson, who's written a good recent book on the French Revolution, there was a sudden shift of power from the bourgeois revolutionaries in the assembly to the sans-culottes and the commune. The sans-culottes were the people of Paris, who I said earlier had an outsized influence on the revolution because they could surround the government buildings and put pressure on politicians. Sans-culottes means without pants. It does. But it meant without the knee breeches you've probably seen in movies, right? Pants that go down to the knees and then kind of stockings underneath that. It's the rich guys that wore the knee breeches. So to call the sans-culottes without pants means these are just average dudes that wear like slacks or jeans like most people do today, not the fancy pants stuff that the rich were wearing. So the sans-culottes and the Paris Commune started to show that power was shifting into their hands, especially at the hands of some of the leaders that rose to the top there. The Jacobin Club was the thought police of the revolution in many ways, according to the same author. If the Jacobins believed some new doctrine, that was the required orthodoxy, and to protest against it was to risk expulsion from the club, which could easily be the first step towards being denounced to the Revolutionary Tribunal. So you have a situation where you pretty much had to toe the line. They didn't allow you to criticize the revolution or criticize whatever the accepted doctrine or idea or theory was of the day, or you basically got canceled. Talk about cancel culture. In the French Revolution, when you got canceled, it often meant you got guillotined. So that's really getting canceled. The crowd power of the Commune actually brought down the Girondins, which again were the most radical group in the revolutionary government for a time. But for a time was kind of always the key, because there always seemed to be someone who outflanked you on the left, moving the revolution in a more radical direction. Further left means closer and closer to what we call socialism and communism today. Then there was a wicked symbiosis between the Jacobin leaders and the sans-culottes. And I've kind of made this up here. I'm not quoting anyone but myself. But the mob of sans-culottes are telling their favored politician, take your pick, You've got Danton, Marat, Robespierre there, another guy named Jacques Hébert. All these guys were jockeying for position and power within the assembly, partly to advance their own selfish interests and careers, partially because they believed what they were doing was right. But they realized, at least those that succeeded realized, like Robespierre, that you have to do what the mob wants. These people that can surround the government buildings, putting pressure on the politicians every day. So the mob is, in a sense, saying, if you get extreme, we'll support you. And the leader, whether it's Robespierre or Danton, whoever, gets more extreme. Then the mob says, well done. Now, if you get even more extreme, we'll continue to support you. What does the leader do? Gets even more extreme. The mob, excellent. Now we're getting somewhere. And if you get as extreme as possible, we'll keep supporting you. What does the leader do? Gets as extreme as possible. And extreme often meant bloodshed, turning on people that were considered enemies of the sans-culottes, enemies of the revolution, and then denouncing them, getting them arrested, and sometimes imprisoned and guillotined. In the end, in the competition to get the support of the people of Paris, the sans-culottes, Robespierre won out over Danton and Hébert, which means he basically went further in enlisting the street power of the sans-culottes, getting them behind him, and did that through supporting of bloodshed. The crowd seemed to always sort of want more blood, more scalps, more heads, literally speaking. So Robespierre seemed to be willing to go further than anybody else in doing what they wanted. Not all the politicians in the assembly were working to get the most radical sans-culottes, the Paris commune, behind them. But those that didn't were more likely to get arrested and guillotined themselves, denounced, or just not have much power in the assembly. If that's all not crazy enough, in June of 1792, Paris was gripped by fear and paranoia as all kinds of rumors spread about possible counter-revolution, and there actually were some counter-revolutionary rumblings, and armies eventually formed in parts of France. And there were rumors that there were foreign spies and nobles that were still living in France. Some of them were, a lot of them had already fled. Because they're getting guillotined increasingly as enemies of the revolution, just for being rich in many cases. But so some of the fears of the revolutionaries and the people that supported the revolution, the government itself, were well-founded, but this turned into paranoia quickly. And so almost anybody could be suspected of being a counter-revolutionary against the revolution. And with this kind of fear kind of peaking in the summer of 1792, probably partially because of the heat of the summer, leaders like Robespierre and Marat actually kind of stirred up even more paranoia and anger, apparently intentionally, and saw the people of Paris, including a paramilitary force known as the National Guard, attack the Tuileries, which is one of the many palaces of the king and queen and their family, massacring about 800 Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard were like the elite force that protected, provided security for the king and queen. The royal family was already gone, fortunately for them, but the sans-culottes, as Ian Davidson says, were now in charge. This would not last, but it was a clear sign that the world was changing. And the central fact in this changing world was that the French revolutionaries had crossed the fatal frontier into illegality. Really, it's worse than that. They've crossed the frontier into lawlessness and anarchy. And this was, chaos drummed up intentionally by leaders like Robespierre and Marat. Right? And this is the kind of bloodshed that the sans-culottes are calling for, that when leaders like Robespierre deliver, it gives Robespierre even more support from the same group, like we talked about in this very slide right here. Next, a couple months later, come the September massacres. Paris still gripped by fear and paranoia. And reading from Professor Perry, quote, as rumors spread that jailed priests and aristocrats, also in jail, were planning to break out of their cells to support enemy forces outside Paris, Parisians panicked. Driven by fear, patriotism, and murderous impulses, they raided prisons and, after an improvised popular court determined the accused's fate, largely on the basis of appearance, hammered and hacked to death 1,200 prisoners, including more than 200 priests. Many of the victims were not political prisoners, but ordinary criminals as well. So another fanatical, hysterical outbreak of violence. People, afraid of their own shadow, fearing counter-revolution and enemies in their midst, and they break into prisons and just slaughter people. Some of whom were political prisoners, like priests. Some of them nobles as political prisoners, and some common criminals. But we're getting the common criminals were getting slayed as well as political prisoners. So the attack on the Tuileries, the September massacres, kind of coming back to back, basically in the same summer, now show that the insanity of this has reached even another level. The revolution finally got completely mad comes with the Reign of Terror in 1793 and 94. As one contemporary said, heads fell like slates from roofs. As you can see, the guillotine and heads being held up by their hair as people are being executed and someone else about to be executed there. The guillotine is a machine that chops your head off with a very heavy, very sharp blade that's dropped inside of the structure that you see coming down, I don't know, 20 feet or so. So it's just physics that takes the head off in one clean, swipe every single time. Show trials began, which means just fake trials. It looks like there's a trial and everybody knows it's the verdict is going to be guilty and the person's going to be executed ahead of time. By the way, something else I said earlier in the class, I just thought of now, but keep in mind this revolution is in some ways the forerunner and the model for the Russian Revolution later on in the class, the Communist Chinese Revolution later in the class. Many of these things happen virtually the same way in those revolutions as well. The law of suspects that was passed established a revolutionary tribunal court, which was the main instrument of the terror. Before it was all said and done, after 14 months of this or so, 500,000 Frenchmen had been arrested, 16,000 executed, 20,000 died in prison. Among the more notable figures guillotined, Marie Antoinette, Louis Philippe, member of the royal family, the Duc d'Orléans, also a member of the royal family, but revolutionaries themselves, extreme radicals like Georges Danton, already mentioned, Camille Desmoulins, Jacques Brissot, Jacques Hébert. All of those guys were card-carrying revolutionaries of a radical stripe, who at one time were considered among the most left-wing, most radical, most cutting-edge revolutionaries. But as happens in these kind of revolutions so often, and again, we'll see it with the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution, these kind of revolutions turn on their young. They eat their young. They eat their own eventually. Nobody was safe from being denounced eventually. Didn't matter. You could have been, your revolutionary credentials could have been impeccable. Some of these guys were. You couldn't even really question how patriotically revolutionary they were, and yet they still got executed and denounced. All it took was one denunciation. It didn't take proof. This is a kangaroo court, and sometimes the executions came about and the denunciations that led to those based on just personal, animosity of one person to another. The Enlightenment thinker Condorcet was executed. The known famed scientist Lavoisier also went to the guillotine as well, and many, many, many other famous people, but thousands that weren't famous, some of whom were at least seen as political prisoners and opponents of the revolution. And again, some people were just got in the way because someone was trying to settle a score with them. I don't know if this happened in a specific case, but I bet it did. But it's a good hypothetical example anyway. If you were just an average person and you owed your landlord, 8 months of back rent, which totaled the thousands of dollars, say by today's money. Well, what happened if just your apartment manager or owner just happened to be denounced by somebody and arrested and guillotined? Gee, that would be unfortunate for him, but it would be a lucky break for you because you wouldn't have to pay everything you owed him any longer. Huh? I wonder how that might happen. I wonder who might just go to the authorities and say, hey, this guy that sort of lives in my building, I heard him through the wall the other night plotting a counter-revolution, an attack on the revolutionary government. And this guy would be then free and clear of all the money he owed. These kind of things did happen over and over again because people saw how lawless this was. It was easy to do. This whole episode didn't bring out the best in human nature. We can put it that way too. Maximilien Robespierre, who'd been around since the beginning, a member of the original assembly, but at first had been kind of a mild-mannered politician, revolutionary politician among many. So he kind of rose quietly, but eventually rose to the very top. And he's now the kind of face of the Reign of Terror because he became the top leader in the whole revolutionary government that brought us the Reign of Terror. I ask, what explains Robespierre's eventually ruthless, pitiless resort to mass violence? Was it just the way he always was? Or did the pressure of the revolution change him? Was this a poisonous attachment to ideology? I would say it's almost certainly that. Is there something about this kind of regime that raised people, whether innately or environmentally motivated, like this to the top? Meaning, is there something about this kind of situation and scenario that sort of inclines people of a certain personality, a certain way of thinking, maybe a certain lack of feeling for fellow human beings, sort of naturally, kind of brings them to the surface, to the top, and that's possible as well. But the attachment to the ideology of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, I think is a big part of this. Robespierre wasn't the only. A lot of his henchmen and advisors felt the same way. But ideology, right, belief in a philosophy, but one that you believe is right, it's the right philosophy, all others are wrong. The more strongly you believe in something like that, self-righteously believe that what I'm doing is right and it's best for humanity, it's the only thing that's going to cause humanity to survive, or the only thing that'll ever bring us sort of the perfect utopian society we want. The more you actually believe that, if you think about it, as Robespierre certainly did, the more apt you are to do anything necessary to bring that about. Lie, cheat, kill, murder, torture, imprison, because you believe the end goal is so virtuous, so correct, that it justifies anything you do. Yeah, I hate to have to, murder thousands of people, but look what I'm doing. On the other side of that is utopia. And everybody that's still alive afterwards will live out their lives in bliss and harmony and peace, and it'll all be wonderful. So I have to do this. So ideologues, someone that's very highly ideological, are often the most dangerous people in history. Again, we'll see it in the Russian Revolution, in China as well, a few other places too. Robespierre said, actually, in the famous statement, if the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is baneful, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than the speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the patrie, which is a French word for the people. So he's doing this in the name of the people, And so sometimes to get to virtue requires a little bit of terror, a little bit or a lot of violence. And at the height of sort of the paranoia about counter-revolution, and when the foreign war wasn't going well, and they've got the revolutionary government has all these irons in the fire, things seem to be not going well. The larger legislature, the assembly, willingly put power in the hands of 12 individuals, the Committee of Public Safety, meaning so to make things easier, to make it easier to make swift decisions like executing people. 12 people made the decisions instead of a whole, large body of hundreds voting. And they did this willingly, but it caused things to kick into even a higher gear of violence. Robespierre was, not surprisingly, the head of the Committee of Public Safety. And he was also the leading Jacobin. I mentioned the Jacobin clubs, but the Jacobins became a party or faction in the assembly that out-lefted the leftist Girondins and put the Girondins basically out of business, and saw many of them go to the guillotine themselves. So Professor Perry says, in June 1793, the Jacobins replaced the Girondins as the dominant group in the National Convention. The Girondins favored a government in which the departments would exercise control over their own affairs. The Jacobins wanted a strong central government with Paris as the center of power. The Jacobins supported temporary governmental controls to deal with the needs of war and economic crisis. This won the support of the sans-culottes. So basically, the Jacobins wanted temporary dominance, kind of away from democracy, and the sans-culottes loved it because they knew they would be bloodthirsty that way. And the Jacobins wanted a strong central government even over the long haul, whereas the Girondins wanted power spread out more to the various departments, which kind of means like states. It's sort of like the debate that's always gone in American history about how much power should be in the hands of the federal government, how much power should be hands in the state government. The Girondins wanted it to be more spread out in the hands of the states or departments. The Jacobins wanted centralized power and the government to take on more and more functions, more and more control, more and more power, which can be a recipe for tyranny and disaster. The problems confronting the Jacobins were staggering. They had to cope with the Civil War, a civil war, economic distress, blockaded ports, foreign countries, and foreign invasion. They lived with the terrible dread that if they failed, the revolution for liberty and equality would perish. Only strong leadership could save the republic, they believed. It was provided by this Committee of Public Safety, serving as a cabinet for the convention or the legislature, assembly, composed of 12 ardent and able patriots, imposed the central government's authority throughout the nation. And boy, did they. This was a rule with an iron fist, if there ever was such a thing, metaphorically. Robespierre and the committee demanded conformity and punished dissenters mercilessly. The guillotine was in swift action throughout the months of the Reign of Terror here. The law of 22 prairiales was known, actually speeded up mass executions. The trials were already a joke, and now they're saying it's taking too long. So they even speeded them up so they could process more criminals, with quotes, criminals, counter-revolutionaries in quotes. But Robespierre suffered the same fate. If there was ever poetic justice, it was here. He was guillotined. And why? Well, since anyone could get guillotined, even, as I said, card-carrying, loyal members of the revolution, members of the assembly, and that was actually happening, day after day, the guys that are still there are coming in, seeing fewer and fewer filled seats. There's more empty seats. So this is my own words, but look at all the empty seats. We're going to be next. What are we going to do? So on one particular day, when they were basically having this conversation before Robespierre and his sort of main members of the committee came in, they started talking and said, we got to do something about this guy because one of us is going to be next. A number of us are going to be next. Every day we walk in, there's 1 or 5 or a handful fewer of us here because they've been denounced and executed. So it's in all of our interest to work together to do something about this guy. And they're able to waylay a couple of soldiers or policemen who actually strong-armed Robespierre and a couple of others when they came in the room that day, locked him away. Robespierre tried to escape, was shot in the jaw, and was locked into a room for the night in agony with his jaw half hanging off, and was taken out and executed, guillotined the next morning, along with his fellow members of the Committee of Public Safety. So the revolution essentially turned even on Robespierre himself. How out of control it got. Now, I think from here, I think you should be able to see at least a slight difference between the Declaration of Independence and George Washington and Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. The closing episode of the revolution could be seen to be the efforts of Gracchus Babeuf, which was his assumed name, and his conspiracy of equals in 1795 and 6. And in some ways, this was the birth of modern socialism. Babeuf edited a newspaper, the Tribune of the People. He was a local government leader for a certain amount of time. He advocated democracy and the abolition of all private property. And he and his cohorts plotted to overthrow the government. By that time, the government was called the Directory, which was already moving a bit away from revolutionary style government. At his trial, he said, "We've only been dreaming of the happiness of our fellow creatures. The revolution has become a new religion, and we long for the day when the great principle of equality would become the sole religion of the peoples. No member of the community should be able to possess anything other than what the law makes available through the agency of the government. Movement of workers from one locale to another may be ordered by the administration in light of the needs and resources of the community." So this guy wants the government to force equality of wealth and property and income, and also control your movements. If the government says you need to be over here, you're going to be over here. If it says they need to move you over there to work over there, you work over there. But hey, you're equal. So this is early socialism and communism in a sense. Society must be made to operate in such a way that it eradicates once and for all the desire of a man to become richer or wiser or more powerful than others. Talk about a commitment to equality. Okay, we could argue about whether it's fair or even possible to stop someone from becoming richer, and whether that's a good thing. If okay, let's equal out wealth, but wiser. So he wants to control so that everybody's about the same intelligence and the same amount of knowledge. Can't have too much intelligence, too much knowledge, because that's unfair. So we've got to kind of keep everybody kind of in a happy middle area. And by the way, this sounds nuts, but it's not. This isn't anything exclusive to Gracchus Babeuf. In fact, many later socialists and communists, some of whom we'll meet, looked back to him as a source of inspiration. The evidence against him, the Insurrectionary Act, no one may leave Paris without a formal and special. This is what he proposed. No one may leave Paris without a formal and special order. All opposition shall be suppressed immediately by force. Those opposing shall be exterminated. Those are his actual words. And he didn't seem to see at his trial that those words would be damning against him, and that he'd be found guilty for sure. But this is a revolution that spun out of control. These are not the American revolutionaries, as I said, revolutionaries in a suit and a tie. These guys have basically become criminals by the end, though they don't think that. They're carried away with their own self-righteousness, believing that what they're doing is going to bring perfection to humanity and bring utopia, which ends up being a dangerous idea, even though it can sound good. Sometimes, the old saying goes, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. Thank you.